releasing water from Lake Powell at the Glen Canyon Dam as part of an environmental restoration project.
A place that was dry for millions of years was just hit by a massive man-made flood that changed the world forever. Engineers opened the jet tubes of a giant dam and sent a wall of water into the Grand Canyon. This water moved millions of tons of sand and silt that had been trapped for decades behind concrete walls. The river rose 16 feet, and the pressure was so great that it rumbled the very foundation of the canyon.
Environmental groups are sounding the alarm about a problem upstream.
This was the first time humans ever tried to create a flood on purpose. And get this, the reasons behind it are more mysterious than the flood itself. Artificial tides rising. At 6:20 in the morning on March 26, 1996, a group of engineers stood on top of the Glen Canyon Dam. They were about to do something that had never been done in human history. They were going to start a flood on purpose. They reached for the controls and opened the first of 4 giant pipes called jet tubes. These tubes are basically massive metal tunnels that let water bypass the normal power plant. Once those tubes opened, a wall of white water shot out into the river below. It looked like a giant fire hose was trying to fill up the entire canyon. Over the next 9 hours, they opened the rest of the tubes and turned on the big turbines. The water was moving at 335,000 gallons per second. To make that easier to understand, imagine an Olympic-sized swimming pool. Now imagine filling that entire pool every 2 seconds. That is how much water was crashing into the canyon. The river did not just rise a little bit. It rose 16 feet higher than it usually sits. In just 1 week, 238 billion gallons of water rushed through the rocky walls of the canyon. This was a massive change for a place that had been very dry and very quiet for a long time. The ground literally shook as the water picked up rocks the size of cars and tossed them downstream. This was the start of the largest man-made flood in the history of the country. Before this happened, the area below the dam was mostly just heat and dust. The natural rhythm of the river had been broken years ago, and scientists were worried. They wanted to see if they could use this massive wall of water to fix the environment. But here is the catch. Nobody really knew if the canyon could take that much pressure without falling apart. The engineers watched the water closely as it carved through the stone. They saw sand and silt that had been sitting still for decades suddenly get picked up and moved. This was not just about moving water from one place to another. It was about trying to act like nature. For millions of years, the river had flooded every spring when the snow melted in the mountains. But after the dam was built, those floods stopped. The river became predictable and slow. This experiment was meant to bring back the wild side of the Colorado River. As the water roared, the sound was so loud you could not even hear yourself scream. It was a beautiful and scary sight at the same time. The water turned a deep red color as it picked up the ancient soil of the desert. This was the first time anyone had seen the river look like its old self in a long time. The flood was so big it could be seen from space as a dark line cutting through the desert. But the true danger was hiding inside the dam itself, where no one could see it. The Colorado River is a very important part of the United States. It runs through 7 states and even crosses into Mexico. But for a long time, the river has been in big trouble. It used to be a powerful force that reached the ocean, but now it usually dries up before it ever gets there. When people go to see the end of the river in Mexico, they do not find water. They find nothing but mud and dust. The waterway that carved the Grand Canyon for 6 million years has been struggling to stay alive. The turning point for this river happened in 1963. That was the year the Glen Canyon Dam was finished. This dam is huge. It is 720 feet tall and 1,600 feet wide. It is a massive wall of concrete that blocks the river and creates Lake Powell. Lake Powell is the second largest reservoir in the entire country. Once that dam went up, the river changed completely for over 260 miles. Basically, the dam acted like a giant stopper in a bottle. It held back all the water and all the sand. About 10 years after the dam was built, scientists noticed something bad. The beaches and sandbars in the Grand Canyon were starting to disappear. These beaches are very important for the animals and the people who visit the canyon. Before the dam, the river brought in millions of tons of fine sand and silt every year. But now, all that sand gets trapped behind the dam at the bottom of the lake. The river below the dam became what scientists call hungry water. This means the water is so clean and clear that it actually eats away at the existing beaches without leaving any new sand behind. River guides who have been rafting there for 40 years watch the beaches vanish before their eyes. What used to be a nice place to camp turned into a pile of jagged rocks. Also, invasive plants started growing everywhere. Plants like tamarisk and Bermuda grass took over the spaces where the sand used to be. The native trees that need the river to flood started to die off because the water stayed in one place for too long. Since the dam was finished, the amount of sand reaching the Grand Canyon has dropped by more than 90%. This is why the scientists decided they had to do the big flood experiment. They realized that if they did not do something soon, the Grand Canyon would lose all of its soft edges. The river would just be a cold, clear stream at the bottom of a stone hallway. It is not that simple, though, because the river is now managed by humans instead of nature. We change the water level based on how much electricity people in the city need. When you turn on your lights in the morning, the dam releases more water. When you go to sleep, it slows down. This constant up and down is not what the canyon is used to. The crazy part is that a tiny mistake in the past almost destroyed the entire dam. Exploding water tunnels. In the summer of 1983, the river decided to show humans who was really in charge. There was a huge amount of snow in the mountains that year, and it all melted at once. Lake Powell filled up so fast that the engineers got scared. They had to release water as fast as possible to keep the dam from overflowing. They opened the spillways, which are giant tunnels carved into the rock next to the dam. The water was moving at 726,000 gallons per second. This was even more water than the man-made flood of 1996. As the water rushed through the tunnels, something very strange happened. The water coming out of the tunnels suddenly turned bright red. It looked like the river was bleeding. The engineers realized the water was moving so fast it was actually ripping the concrete lining right off the tunnel walls. It was also tearing huge chunks of sandstone out of the mountain. This happened because of something called cavitation. When water moves super fast, tiny bubbles form and then collapse with a huge amount of force. These bubbles act like tiny sticks of dynamite that blow holes in the concrete. At one point, people were afraid the tunnels would collapse and the whole dam would break. Luckily, they were able to fix the problem before the dam was damaged. But after the water went back down, people were shocked by what they saw. Even though the flood was scary, it had actually fixed the river for a little while. Many of the beaches that had been dry and empty were now covered in fresh sand. The powerful water had washed away the invasive plants and created new homes for the fish. This was the moment scientists realized that floods are actually good for the canyon. They saw that the river needs to be wild every once in a while to stay healthy. This led to the planned experiments in 2004 and 2008. They timed these floods to happen right after big storms brought sand into the river from other smaller streams. During these tests, the water turned muddy and dark, which is exactly how a healthy river should look. The engineers learned how to move the water without breaking the tunnels this time. They developed a new plan to do these floods whenever there is enough sand built up in the river. This means the flood happens when nature is ready, not just when humans want it. They use cameras and sensors to watch the sand move in real time. But the sand is protecting something much older than the dam or the river explorers. The Colorado River is not just about water and power. It is also about memory and history. For thousands of years, indigenous people have lived in and around the Grand Canyon. The river is like a giant vein that keeps the history of the land alive. One of the most important jobs of the sandbars is to protect ancient archaeological sites. There are thousands of these sites along the river. They include stone houses, places to store food, and old trails. Some of these sites are over 9,000 years old. That is older than the pyramids in Egypt. The people who lived there grew corn and beans in the fields near the water. They also left behind beautiful carvings in the rocks and paintings on the canyon walls. These things are part of the heritage of tribes like the Pueblo people. If the sand disappears, these sites are left out in the open. The wind and the rain start to eat away at the old stone walls. Without a thick layer of sand to cover them, these pieces of history would just crumble and vanish forever. The man-made floods help by blowing sand up onto the banks where it can cover these ancient homes. This acts like a giant blanket that keeps the history safe. Scientists have found cooking pits and places where people used to make stone tools thousands of years ago. Most of these finds are from between the years 750 and 1250. This was a time when the canyon was full of life and farming. Today, the tribes still consider this land sacred. They watch the river closely to make sure their ancestors' homes are being treated with respect. The floods are a way to make sure the river keeps providing that protection. It is a very delicate balance. If there is too much water, it could wash the sites away. If there is too little water, the wind will blow the sites away. Engineers have to be very careful to get the timing just right. They want to move the sand without destroying the very things they are trying to save. This is one of the most important reasons why the flood experiments continue today. What most people do not realize is that saving this history costs a huge amount of money. Future flow choices. In the year 2012, the United States government pivoted toward a radical new philosophy regarding the management of the Colorado River. They drafted a plan to keep the experimental floods going on a regular schedule, deciding that the biological health of the river was finally worth the monumental effort and the staggering cost. But here is the real deal. Every single time they initiate a high-flow experiment, it triggers a financial hemorrhage. The water that screams through the bypass jet tubes is water that is not spinning the massive electricity turbines inside the Glen Canyon Dam. This means the dam's power output drops to a fraction of its capacity. Energy companies lose millions of dollars every single time those gates open. The Glen Canyon Dam provides baseline power to several different states, and when the turbines slow down, the grid doesn't just wait for the river to recover. Instead, those states are forced to scramble, sourcing their energy from more expensive and dirtier places like coal-fired plants or natural gas facilities. This creates a perpetual, simmering war between the environmentalists who want to save the river's soul and the corporate interests who demand cheap, reliable energy for the desert's sprawling neon cities. The very first flood back in 1996 resulted in a loss of about $1,800,000 in potential energy revenue. At first glance, that might not sound like a catastrophic amount for a multi-state power authority, but these numbers compound. Over decades, we are talking about hundreds of millions of dollars literally washed downstream in the name of moving sand from one side of a bank to the other. While the official narrative focuses on sandbars and humpback chubs, a much stranger set of theories circulates among the canyon's river rats and fringe historians. There is a persistent whisper that the water levels of Lake Powell and the subsequent floods are managed with a second secret purpose: to hide or reveal ancient entrances. In 1909, a controversial story in the Arizona Gazette claimed an explorer named G.E. Kincaid found a massive underground citadel filled with Egyptian-style artifacts deep within the canyon walls. Some theorists believe the Glen Canyon Dam was strategically placed not just for power, but to act as a literal plug for a subterranean network that leads into the crust of the earth. According to this wilder line of thinking, the controlled floods are used to flush sediment into specific side canyons to bury evidence of these ancient civilizations whenever the water levels get low enough for hikers to start poking around. Are the millions of dollars in lost power revenue actually a silence tax, paid to keep the public from seeing what lies beneath the silt? Even if you don't believe in hidden underground cities, the reality on the surface is grim enough. The American West is currently suffocating under the weight of the worst drought in 1,200 years. This isn't just a dry spell, it is a fundamental shift in the climate of the continent. There is simply not enough water to go around anymore. In 2018, the experimental floods had to stop entirely. For 5 long years, the jet tubes remained dry, and the river below the dam became sluggish and choked with invasive vegetation. The Bureau of Reclamation couldn't afford to waste a single drop of fuel, which is what water essentially is in a reservoir system. Lake Powell was dropping so low that experts began to whisper about dead pool, the terrifying point where the water level falls below the intake pipes, rendering the dam useless for both power and downstream flow. It wasn't until April of 2023 that a massive winter snowpack finally provided enough of a surplus to perform another 72-hour high-flow release. While this was celebrated as a massive win for the river's ecology, the victory felt fragile. The Great Thirst Agenda. This brings us to another dark theory that haunts the chat rooms of the Mojave: the manufactured scarcity hypothesis. Some observers suggest that the water crisis isn't entirely a natural disaster, but a managed collapse intended to force the population out of rural desert towns and into smart city hubs where resources can be strictly rationed and monitored. They point to the fact that while residents are told to let their lawns die, Massive data centers for tech giants, which require millions of gallons of water for cooling, continue to pop up in the desert like mushrooms after a rainstorm. Is the Colorado River being drained not by the sun, but by the thirst of the digital age? There are those who believe the water isn't disappearing, but is being diverted into massive, undisclosed underground aquifers to serve a breakaway civilization of the ultra-wealthy, leaving the 40 million people on the surface to fight over the remaining muddy puddles. Today, 40 million people depend on the Colorado River for their basic survival. It is the lifeblood for drinking water in cities from Denver to Los Angeles. It irrigates 5.5 million acres of farmland, producing the majority of the winter vegetables for the entire United States. We use this ancient glacial runoff for everything from flushing toilets in Las Vegas to keeping the fairways green on luxury golf courses in Scottsdale. The problem is the law of the river. The rules we use to share this water are over 100 years old. They were drafted in 1922, a time when the West was mostly empty space, and the planners mistakenly used one of the wettest decades in history to set their baseline for how much water the river could provide. They over-allocated the river, promising more water to the states than the river actually carries. Now, we are living in a mathematical impossibility. Environmentalists argue that we need to learn to reuse every single drop, recycling wastewater directly back into our taps, if we want the river to survive. But the political tension is thick. 7 states and the country of Mexico are locked in a legal stalemate, each refusing to be the first to blink and take a permanent cut to their water supply. Some geologists have proposed a theory that adds a layer of physical danger to this water management. The weight of the water held behind the Glen Canyon Dam is so immense, billions of tons, that it actually depresses the Earth's crust. This is known as reservoir-induced seismicity. There is a wild theory that the dam is actually pinning a major fault line in place. According to this idea, if we were to drain Lake Powell too quickly to save the river, the sudden release of pressure could trigger a massive tectonic adjustment, leading to earthquakes that could shatter the very infrastructure we rely on. In this scenario, the dam isn't just a power plant. It's a giant paperweight holding back a geological catastrophe. This makes the decision to flood or not to flood a high-stakes game of planetary physics. If the river dries up completely, a scenario that is no longer science fiction, the Grand Canyon will transform into a hauntingly different place. The legendary rafting industry would vanish overnight. The 27,000 people who float down those rapids every year, seeking a connection to the prehistoric world, would find only a canyon of dust and boulders. The wildlife would be the first to leave. The bald eagles, the bighorn sheep, and the rare fish would disappear, and the canyon would become a hot, silent desert. The ancient cottonwood trees would die off, and the cooling shade they provide would vanish, leaving the temperatures at the bottom of the gorge to soar to lethal levels. Towns near the canyon rim, like Tucson, depend on the water that hides in deep underground aquifers. But those aquifers are fed by the river and the snowmelt. If the river stops flowing, the pressure that keeps those wells full might vanish. Those towns would become ghost towns, bleached white by the relentless sun. We are currently facing a choice between our deeply ingrained habits and the literal survival of the most iconic river in the Western Hemisphere. It is a puzzle that has stumped the greatest minds in hydrology and policy for a century. So far, no one has found a perfect answer that satisfies the farmers, the city dwellers, and the fish. Can we really save the Grand Canyon while 40 million people are still thirsty for its water? Make sure you hit the like button and subscribe for more mysteries like this.